أعلنا الجهاد على أمريكا.
We declared a jihad, a holy war against the United States government because it is unjust, criminal, and tyrannical.
Good morning, America. I'm Charles Gibson.
I'm Diane Sawyer, and it's Tuesday, September 11th, 2001.
It is lunchtime in London, 5 a.m. in Los Angeles, and 8 a.m. here in New York, live from the CNN Financial News headquarters.
It is beautiful outside, perfect September day with lots of sunshine. Oh, would you look at Washington, huh? I'm going outside today.
Other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet.
Remember, it is shortly before 9 o'clock East Coast time, so we suspect there would have been a great many people in the building and presumably on those top floors as well.
The programs normally scheduled will not be seen this evening, so that we may bring you the following special report from CBS News.
It looks like something you'd see maybe in Bosnia, where a shelling would occur.
Good evening. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world. The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda.
Terrorism is the use or threat of action designed to influence the government or an international governmental organization, or to intimidate the public or a section of the public, made for the purposes of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause, and it involves or causes serious violence against a person, serious damage to property, a threat to a person's life, a serious risk to health and safety of the public, or serious interference with or disruption to an electronic system. There are many different terrorist organizations with different backgrounds and intentions. Even though a large amount of terrorists are radical Islamists, all terrorists are not Islamic extremists. The attack carried out by Al-Qaeda on September 11, 2001 in New York was the first major modern terrorist attack that really began discussions on terrorism and also sparked a war on terror. Even though this was not the first instance of terrorism in history, it led to an open declaration of war on terror by the U.S.
The root word for terrorism is taken from a Latin term that means to frighten, meaning terrorists use their power and weapons to frighten citizens and conquer them out of fear. The first terrorist group was during the 14th century AD. It was called the Zealots of Judah. Known by the Romans as daggermen, this organization carried out underground assassinations of Roman occupation forces and Jews. Because of them killing all those innocent people, they were considered terrorists, but no one knew about that term until later on. Maximilien Robespierre, a terrorist leader during the French Revolution, was one of the first known terrorist organizations ever. He caused a lot of bloodshed during the time period, and people lived in fear of him. Any who opposed him was squashed. This time period was known as the Reign of Terror. After Robespierre got overthrown and executed, people started using the word terrorist to describe someone who abuses their power through a threat of force. This led up to organizations such as slavery, the KKK, Taliban, and ISIS. But Maximilien Robespierre was the origin of terrorism, and that's what led to all those radical terrorist organizations that I just listed.
$80,000 to 100,000 current fighting ISIS soldiers, 20,000 to 31,500 current fighting US soldiers. The attacks of September 11, 2001, known as 9/11, marked a turning point in world history in the beginning of the War on Terror. Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. The U.S. has conducted 15,530 strikes in Iraq and Syria. The rest of the world has only conducted 4,072 strikes in Iraq and Syria.
Terrorism is a problem to our world and has caused many difficulties throughout. People have done deep research on terrorism to learn more about it. We have been able to contact two experts, Dr. Shiro from the University of Washington and Mr. Broody from Mount Vernon Presbyterian School.
How come it exists? How dangerous it is? What can be done about it? Those are all very closely related issues. And there's been terror before. Now it seems to be linked to a kind of a religious war going on within the Muslim world. That has to be understood.
I think you have to start with the definition of a war on terror. You can have a war on a country, you can have a war on a people. Can you have a war on an idea? Terrorism. Because as we've seen over the course of the history, and especially since, 9/11, the war on terrorism has taken us a whole bunch of places. We've been in the Middle East, we've been in the Far East, we've been in Africa, we've been in Europe. Do you count places like Venezuela and Colombia with FARC, and a whole bunch of other places? So I think the hardest thing is, if you're going to have a war on terrorism, if you're going to have a war on an idea, you're going to have to be prepared for the fact that it's not going to be one person, and they're not all going to look the same. It's not like having a war on the Germans, or a war on the Chinese, or a war on the Japanese, or whatever it is. It's going to be looking at people who otherwise you might not necessarily recognize them as the bad guy.
Well, understanding what the causes are, why some people are willing to sacrifice their lives for a cause, and what is terrorism in general? Terrorism is the weapon of the weak. It's when those who can't afford or can't have access to airplanes and bombers and missiles and tanks, they use terrorism. It's a form of warfare, but it's conducted by those who are too weak to conduct more regular warfare. What are the conditions that lead to it? Well, you have to know what the conditions are that have caused the conflict in the first place, and then figure out why is it that some who are weaker feel that their only alternative is to use terrorism as a weapon.
All right, well, I guess you have to start with looking at where terrorism, especially today, is focused. So let's take ISIS, for instance. So generally speaking, people who join ISIS are poor, disadvantaged. They've been through upheaval in their lives. I mean, the Syrian civil war has been going on for 6 or 7 years at this point. They're targeting young people, and they're effectively indoctrinating them from a very, very young age. They go to madrasas. They go to, they're given a very warped interpretation of the Quran and of Islam. So I guess the biggest condition is you have to educate these people from a young age, and you have to prevent them from being radicalized at a young age. It's like learning a language. If you learn a language very, very young, you're going to be really good at that language, and that's all that language that you're going to know by the time you're older. If you're indoctrinated and if you're exposed to terrorism from a very, very, very young age, and you've been taught for years and years and years that the West is the enemy, and the Americans are the enemy, and they're the infidel, and all those kinds of things, you're going to believe it, and that's all that you're going to know. How do you get to them from a very young age? That's a very tricky scenario. I come back again to ISIS. We're not dropping American troops, many at least. We are a little bit, but not en masse. We're not dropping American troops in to win hearts and minds. We tried that in Iraq. It worked to a certain degree, but also huge problems there. So I mean, you have to identify. You have to increase living conditions. You have to identify them from a young age, and it has to be continuous. Yes. You can't bomb in and bomb out, or go in and go out. Bomb is the wrong word. You can't go in and go out. You can't say the mission is accomplished or we're done here, job finished, because we've seen what happens when we pull out or we stop or we go away after a while.
Well, with respect to terrorism, especially of the kind that exists now, by the way, much more in Europe than in the United States, military action is not at all helpful because the people who engage in it, so in Europe, they're individuals, many who were born in the countries where they conduct terrorist operations. Some who have come in, but many who are themselves citizens of the countries where they've done these things. Most of the recent terrorist acts by Muslims in the United States have been conducted by American citizens. So military action doesn't really do much. In Europe especially, but to some extent in the United States, people are recruited, sometimes on the internet, from within a community where there are many people who feel a sense of grievance. So trying to do something about that sense of grievance in those communities is more helpful than military action. Take, for example, some of the recent events in France. So what does military action do if the man who, say, drove a truck into a crowd and killed a bunch of people was living in France? What is the military going to do? Bomb parts of France? No. So it's a question of using intelligence, using good police work, and reaching out to the communities from which these people are recruited in order to find out who is a potential joiner of such a movement, to find out what can be done to relieve frustrations in those communities. That's much more helpful than military action. In fact, military action since the 9/11, 2001 events that killed 3,000 people in the World Trade Center, military intervention in Afghanistan and even much more in Iraq by the United States has only created more terrorism. And trying to go after Muslim communities in general creates more of a sense of grievance. So military action is not a very useful way of trying to combat this.
That's the big question right now with a terrorist organization like ISIS, which is what is the best response? And what's unique to Syria, and I know we talked about this last semester, but what's unique to Syria is there's no good answer. There's no one person, there's no one group, there's no moderate faction. You know, we talked about in the very beginning of the battle against ISIS when we realized, oh crap, this group is a thing and they're not going anywhere. We talked about, like, okay, well, let's find the moderate forces in Syria who are on the good guys, on the good side, and we can find them and work with them against ISIS. Well, then we looked and looked and looked and looked and looked, and there was nobody. And, you know, effectively, and it's way more complicated than this, but you have to, we identified as effectively two sides in the war in Syria, Assad and ISIS. That's like, do you want cancer or do you want, you know, like something else that's really, really bad? And so, you know, the way that it's working right now in Iraq, it's a little bit better because we found that moderate force. So the moderate force that we found, the Peshmergas and the Kurds. And they have had tremendous success against Al-Qaeda and not Al-Qaeda, ISIS in Mosul and in northern Iraq and in getting them out. So are they the answer for Syria as well? I don't know. That's going to be another problem, especially the Kurds represent their own issue, which is, if you look at their activities with Turkey and the Kurds, not so much. To the point where Turkey acts out against the Kurds and tries to take them out, and the Kurds have taken a lot of Turkish military forces out and police forces out. There are bombings in Turkey way more frequently than they'd like to admit of Kurdish rebels trying to send a message to, the Turkish government. So could they be characterized as a terrorist organization? Depends on who you talk to. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it's complicated.
Yeah, it's a complicated question.
Well, as I just said, there has to be a sense of grievance in communities. So there's not much we can do about the conflict within societies, Muslim societies, particularly in the Middle East. What we can do something about is addressing Muslims in our own country and finding out why is it that a small minority of them, it's certainly not the majority, it's not even a very large minority, but there are some. Why do they feel this sense of grievance? How come they can get recruited on the internet or get attracted to going to Syria to fight in the civil war there and then coming back with skills that allow them to become terrorists? Find out what's going on, who are these people, why, what do their families think about it? Is it possible to do something about their sense of frustration, or is it just a matter of good police work, which is used against racketeers and against criminals to find out what's going on, or it's used, for example, in fighting against people who import lots of drugs, having appropriate domestic intelligence. Those are the things that can be done. And those are more important for combating terrorism within Europe or the United States than anything else.
An organization like ISIS, with their warped interpretation of religion, is regular everyday people in that region who hate them. And hate is a strong word, but they do. They don't call them ISIS. So I have family in Lebanon, and I was in Lebanon last year and a couple of years before that. And when I was there last, we were talking a bunch about ISIS and all these kinds of things. They actually don't call them ISIS. They call them Daesh. And Daesh it's a derogatory term for them. I don't know what it means, but it's a derogatory term for them. And they hate them because they say, this is not Islam. This is not our religion. This is not what we believe. This is an incredibly warped view of a religion that, for the most part, tolerates peace and prosperity and happiness and all these kinds of things. Now, Christianity's got their own version of warped interpretation, whatever it is. Judaism has exactly the same thing. The problem with ISIS is that even though they're a very, very, very small entity, they're all we read in the news about Islam, unfortunately. You don't read about all the other members of the Islamic faith and religion who are law-abiding and completely regular and go about their everyday lives, and it's no big deal. I think that, again, to come back to the original point, which I think answers your question the best way to detach religion from it entirely is to have people who live in that region, who know the culture, who are of the religion themselves, say, this is what they say they are not. They are charlatans, they are liars, they're murderers, they're crazy people. And let me point you to all of these other amazing people who I live with and work with and interact with on an everyday basis who are nothing like these guys. So I think that's the best way to answer that.
You're speaking about your...
Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us that the greater risk lies in appeasement. And this is the specter our well-meaning liberal friends refuse to face, that their policy of accommodation is appeasement. And it gives no choice between peace and war, only between fight or surrender. If we continue to accommodate, continue to back and retreat, eventually we have to face the final demand, the ultimatum. And what then? When Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be. He has told them that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday, when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by that time, we will have been weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically. He believes this because from our side he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better read than dead, or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance.